So, welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight. And today, Enna Reittort is back, and we are going to talk about her new book that she is researching and writing. Enna, I remember the first time we spoke, you said something about Krivda, because your first book has the title Krivda, The Godrix versus the Matrix. And you said something along the lines, if I remember correctly, that Krivda is not a very well-known word, even in Russia, and that it describes something that uh, we could call distorted reality.
Hmm.
Um, how
Yeah,
did you
that's another word.
stumble on that word?
Oh, then as I was still in the early phases of writing that first book, and I talked about it to a Russian friend, talking about deceit and the deceit embedded in the phenomenon of religion. And he said, "Oh, do you know the word krivda?" And I said, "No, I've never heard it, but I know the root kriv, which means crooked, and then da, which is the same thing that you had at the end of pravda. Pravda means truth. So I would deduct that it means crooked truth." Yes, he said. So, so there. And I found it so powerful. That's the thing, with words. And I think you have that in German also, as we have in Russian. Certain words, or a lot of the words in Russian, carry a kind of vibrational charge that is not just the sound that you hear, but there's something inside. And this has to do with the feeling that I have increasingly is that our languages have evolved and degraded from way, way, way back when we started to name things from the sense of inner vibration that we received from these things. And that is something that I feel particularly strongly with certain or many Russian words. And when Krivda happened to me, I mean, I was like electric current going up and down my spine. And so I just knew that's the title of the book. Okay, it doesn't mean anything to anybody in English, and it goes against all the rules of marketing your books. So be it. So there we are with Krivda.
Hmm. Yeah. So, and from what I understand, the book that you're researching and writing now is about Russia. Yeah.
Yeah,
Would you call it a let's say a history of Russia?
I'm not a historian, and the history of Russia is so contentious. There are so many points of view. There are so many hidden agendas. It's just mind-boggling. However, it's very interesting that since the fall of the Soviet Union, historians who developed some very solid traditions and schools of scholarship, real sort of, erudition. But they were, in the Soviet days, they had to fit everything within the Marxist ideology. And in certain cases, you can really see that it just doesn't work, but they had to do it. They were released from that when the USSR fell. Lots of awful things happened to Russia, but in terms of being able to do your thinking without having to fit this or that particular ideology, even though most of the historians, most of the, journalists, what have you, were now beholden to the Western capitalist, democratic, liberal, human rights ideology that that you know the Russians have a different, I've discovered that the Russians have a different sense of what human rights are. And it's actually something that's much deeper, but we can talk about that later. So anyway, I stumbled many years ago upon videos. I started, there was YouTube and there were Russian videos on YouTube. And I stumbled upon historians who were redoing Russian history that was now alive, that was really looking for, doing like investigative, really detective work, and coming out with, things that I'd never heard before. I have a master's in Slavic studies, but I'd never heard these things before. I'd never even suspected them. And so, okay, I started watching all this stuff and getting increasingly confused because, well, there's good stuff and there's less good stuff. And the other thing is that I've been inhabited ever since birth, I think, by Russian mystery. My father was a diplomat, and he had his very first posting to the USSR in the last years of Stalin. And I was born not very long after that. So even in early childhood, and he fell in love with Russia, although he was representing a Western country that was very much in the Cold War against Russia. So I've grown up with that ambivalence. And then he was sent back to Russia when I was 15. Now he was, a high-ranking diplomat. And so off we go to Russia. And one thing I must credit him for is that he always encouraged, at least me, to, learn the local language and to, find out about the local culture. We were never kept in a diplomatic ghetto. Most of the diplomats in Moscow, they all lived amongst themselves. There was literally a diplomatic ghetto. My father was one of the few who spoke good Russian, and I actually had my first year in university there with, with Soviet elite kids, basically elite kids. And those 3 years that I spent from, 15 to 18 was just purely taking in stuff I couldn't understand. It didn't make sense. The anti-Russian, anti-Soviet propaganda that, of course, I'd been fed in the West didn't make sense in this country where I was seeing people who were living normally. I could see there were people living bourgeois lifestyles like in the West. There were people sweeping the streets, except they were very strong and they were not humble. There were queues in front of shops, but people had plenty of stuff on their tables. There were microphones, in the house where we lived. I knew that everything I did, everything I said was monitored, but I figured, okay, this is an experience like I'm never going to have again, so I'm going to make the most of it. And I just imbibed everything. And then when I went back to the West, it took me 10 years to get used to being in the West again. Whatever it is I had imbibed, there was a charge of something that I couldn't explain. And, later after the fall of the Soviet Union, I went back, I did sorts of different, work, ethnomusicological, music, singing. Then, I didn't go back. I haven't been back since the 1990s. It was just too heartbreaking. The ruin, the poverty, it was just absolutely terrible. Little old people who had always had a pension and an apartment and, food and tickets to the Bolshoi Theater and all that kind of thing, who were selling their last pair of stockings in the streets to be able to eat a piece of bread. It was just absolutely awful. So, okay. And, in the meantime, I never stopped, reading in Russian and somehow keeping an internal connection with Russia. And then, okay, COVID came, Krivda, and then the other book after that. And then I figured, well, okay, now at last I'm going to be able to write the book about my crazy Bengali grassroots esoteric people that we talked about, I think, last time or on some recent talk that we had. Because, this is something that really needs to be well articulated for a Western audience in terms of a completely non-religious, non-God, no priest, absolutely humanistic path. So I started writing that one, and as the time before, this other book, Little Voice, Russia. Oh no. Okay, but by then I'd started ordering books from all these new historians in Russia who were no longer straitjacketed by Marxism, but they were no longer straitjacketed by the earlier Tsarist, great Russia, great imperial Russia bias in history. And they were beginning to look at archives in a completely new way. And so, this fired me up, and I figured, okay. I still haven't found the book that explains to me who the hell these people are. What the hell is,
people?
sorry,
Which people?
Russians.
Ah, oh, okay.
Yeah, we're not talking about the Bengalis anymore. It's the Russians. What the hell is that country? Why the hell is this, is it necessary for the West to keep pouring shit all over Russia when, including in many, many cases where, what Russia is being blamed for is not Russia's doing. And so, okay, I started reading and reading and reading and reading. I mean, I've been reading nonstop, only Russian stuff, for the past couple of years or so. And well, I've discovered, thanks to these historians, some really major facts that nobody in the West knows, apart from a very small handful of historians whose books cannot be read by the majority because most of it is, footnotes and things like that. It makes it really, really hard to read. And so I'm to answer your question, I can't write history. I'm not a historian. I don't have access to sources in Russia. And I'm not interested in history the way classically history has been written and taught to us. I'm sick and tired of history it's just boring. It's always the events, and this king did that, and that queen did this, and then there was this war, and then yes, everybody went hungry, and then 20 years later everything was fine again, and so now it was that country who went, oh shit. And a lot of Russian history is like that, but it doesn't make head or tail. It doesn't make sense. Whatever I do remember from the history of Russia that I did learn, it never made sense. And then, this whole business of suddenly they have this revolution in 1917, and then there's these, Bolsheviks who take power. I mean, it just doesn't work. So in the meantime, of course, I've been exposed to all the prejudice that there is in the West, including in people now who are warming up to Russia, because Putin seems to be much more level-headed than all the other Western leaders. And so, people are beginning to realize that this whole polarization, Ukraine, Russia, and all this shit is, well, it's it's orchestrated by NATO in the West, and there's an old history with Ukraine and the Banderites and all this kind of thing. But somehow for these people, even though they're warming up to Russia, there is still the fact that Soviet Union was terrible. It was the Gulag for everybody, and that so many people were killed, and then the Holodomor, and Stalin starved millions of people. And I'm sorry, I read lots of books, recent books, done by impeccable historians who have worked in the archives of all these different things, and it is not true. It's not. It is true that there have been repressions. It is true that a lot of stuff has had to be very violent. People don't realize that Russia has actually been in the crosshairs of the West for a very long time.
I
And it
remember
starts.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah, you remember reading what?
I remember long time ago when I was a teenager, I read a book about from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. and he wrote about life in the gulags. So would you go as far as saying there were no gulags at all,
Oh,
or?
no, 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 no. There were gulags.
Mm,
Definitely. There definitely were gulags. But we have to remember that the concentration camp was not an invention of the Soviets.
mm,
Okay, the first official concentration camps were by the Brits in South Africa.
yeah.
Okay. And then, you know, before World War One, and then again before World War Two, the Western countries, you know, tens of thousands of people were locked up in concentration camps. All the poor people with, a grandmother from Japan, you were locked up. So the kind of
The US
blanket,
also incarcerated the Japanese population.
absolutely, absolutely, yeah. I mean, and the Brits and the French, I mean, they all did it.
Mm.
So there again, the hypocrisy of why are you going to pile the shit on the USSR? They, when they came out of the revolution and the Civil War, most of the Civil War was orchestrated from outside. If it had been just a civil war, Russia on Russia, would have been done in, 6 months. But the foreign powers needed the civil war to continue as long as possible to make Russia even weaker and even weaker and even weaker so that they could lay their big grubby hands on Russia, which had been their dream for a long time already. So it was just, the Bolsheviks, they had a sense of we have to get this place in order. Otherwise, Russia is no longer going to exist. And there was a hell of a lot of criminality. The criminality, when you're, a country in ruin, the criminality is off the charts. It's always like that, not specifically Russian. And so they had to start locking people up. And at the same time, they needed to start rebuilding industries that had been, going to ruin. And well, they figured, okay, the people in the gulags, we're not going to just feed them for free, they're going to work. So some gulags, some of the camps were absolutely awful. A hell of a lot depended on the mentality of the director. If he was a sadist, things were pretty awful. But there were other camps where, I mean, there are kids. I saw a video of a guy who had been the child of a gulag, um, officer, somebody, a guard or whatever. And he said, we were better fed inside the camp than people were in the villages all around where, free people were. So there was a lot of variation. The other thing about Solzhenitsyn has been thoroughly debunked
Mhm.
by people who've gone, by Russians, recent books, once again, I buy up all the recent books that I can, which is not necessarily easy because we can't do, trade directly with Russia because of SWIFT no longer working. Anyway, so I got books about Solzhenitsyn, and he never, most of the 8 years that he was in principle in the Gulag system, most of those years he managed to get himself into the very comfortable research units. Some of the Gulag units were they were organized so that incarcerated engineers, scientists who were suspected of being, against against the government, against the Soviet system, so that they could continue working in their fields of expertise. And so they had, they had a kind of campus with, the best food in town, very comfortable, rooms and facilities. I mean, they lived better than most people out in the outside world, except they couldn't, they were locked up. That was the only difference. And so he managed to get himself into those kinds of units, although he had none of the skills to do that. So he was very crafty. Finally, he was discovered, and they sent him for the last year or two to a real camp. And well, he had a bit of a hard time there because he was used to comfort. But basically, most of the stuff that he wrote was invented. And he basically worked to gain fame in the USSR. These were the 60s and 70s when dissidents had become fashionable. And his goal was to get himself martyred, basically, as a dissident and exiled, thrown out of the country, which happened, and he went off. And in the USA, he had plenty of advice from CIA, who helped him. He was a terrible writer. You know, he just had notes, bits and pieces of stuff, and he had a team of devoted sort of editors. And with the help of some CIA prompters who helped put together the text of these books. So, you know, and he inflated the figures of the inmates in the gulags. He went up to 40,000, I think, and then his figures were taken up by other people who said, no, 60,000. And it, at some point, it went all the way up to 100, not thousand, million, sorry. It went up to sort of 100 million. Now, the guys who worked in the actual archives of the KGB and Home Affairs Ministry, the archives of those two institutions did not exactly produce the same figure, but very close. One of them produced a figure of 3.8 million, and the other one a figure of just over 4 million. So there were little discrepancies, but basically both these institutions produced approximately the same number of people who, during the period up to Stalin's death, and about 25, from about 25 or 27, 1927, let's say, to 1953, so 3.8 million people were processed through the Gulag system or the prisons. Now, considering the population of the USSR, considering the level of criminality at certain times, considering the very real plots to overthrow the government and work with Germany to defeat the USSR, to make sure that capitalism came back to the USSR, and to return all, you know, all the property to all the people, you know, the rich people who had been kicked out by the revolution. Considering the magnitude of those plots, well, I'm not necessarily surprised that, you know, Stalin and co. would have wanted those people to be put away. And some of them got shot dead. You know, it was not a tender period in history in the West either, you know, in between the two wars. It's only after World War II that life started to become relatively sweet in the West. So, you know, once you get those accounts from honest, I mean, you know, historians whose reputation is impeccable and who are not challenged. You know, there are the other people who continue saying 50 million, 60 million, etc. But, you know, gradually, slowly, the work of those honest historians, it's gradually sort of making its way into the public opinion. And so that's one big thing that is beginning to fall apart. You know, the lies of Solzhenitsyn. And Solzhenitsyn got famous through lying. And a bunch of other people, you know, have also become, you know, favored by the West also through the same kind of attitude.
Yeah,
So yeah,
that is true. I remember what was his name? This oligarch, and he was a big hotshot in oil, and then he Khodorkovsky or something. Anyway,
Khodorkovsky.
Khodorkovsky, yeah, and he was portrayed here in Germany as Yeah, the big hero and who went up against the evil empire in Russia. But actually, what they did, they prevented him from selling the Russian resources to foreigners,
Hmm.
so that Exxon, BP, or whatever can come in and grab the resources, and the Russians can see how they
Yeah,
get.
because what you're describing happened throughout the 1990s.
Hmm.
I mean, the oligarchs, the mafiosi and the top bosses of the Communist Party who were, in the after the death of Stalin, the Communist Party became so corrupt. It's just absolutely mind blowing, mind blowing. And it is they who wanted the Soviet Union to um, make really become friends with the West. Okay, I'm putting it mildly. And so, the way all the assets of the Soviet Union that had been built by the people, that's the thing that people don't realize. This country that was literally in ashes and ruins by 1921, 22, Stalin realized very early that it was a backward, non-industrialized country. The Tsars, I mean, that's another, there's the whole history of what came before, which explains why 1917, 1905, the first revolution, 1917, the two other revolutions, why they happened. And it's not just the bankers who made it happen. It's not just the spies of Britain. It is, the millions and millions and millions and millions of peasants and workers who were absolutely fed up with being treated as cannon fodder, taxation fodder, labor fodder, rape fodder for 300 years. And I mean, the story of that's where the book starts. It starts in the 17th century when this raping of the people starts in a really big way, and it'll continue until the revolution. And they were absolutely fed up. And so, it's the people who swept away the old system. Okay, there were the Bolsheviks and there were other political parties who were doing their propaganda and things like that. But the Bolsheviks had no access to the countryside. And the main force that brought down the old regime was the peasantry. It was 80% of the population. And the Bolsheviks, they didn't know how to deal with the peasants. They were intellectuals. So they did their agitation in the industrial parts of St. Petersburg and Moscow, in the big cities. For them, and according to Marxist theory, proletarians are the spearhead of the revolution. And the peasants are only the petty bourgeois who are, not revolutionary. Consequently, the revolution cannot really happen in Russia. Well, it happened. And, the funny thing is that Lenin and his gang, they were sitting on their chairs in the Kremlin and thinking, well, okay, when are they going to come and fetch us, put us to a wall, put a bullet in between our eyes? They didn't believe that they were going to stay in power, but they did. So, there's all these very interesting, historical facts. But I'm interested in the people
Hmm.
because that is the main ingredient that is missing in most of history that we have learned. But if we could learn history through what the people experienced, I think since we are part of the people, we would be extremely interested in history and we would remember it and we would understand the logic of it.
Yeah. Um, we have Mr. Putin on record saying that the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. Why do you think he felt that way?
I don't think he's wrong. Well, once again, that country, listen, the USSR is basically within within the years up to World War II, Russia pulled herself out of being a failed nation, ruins, with 80% illiteracy, pulled itself up to becoming one of the major powers of the world and becoming a superpower after World War II. How do you think that happens? It's not because the Bolsheviks were going around beating everybody with sticks. It's because the whole people got together to build up their country. They were having the chance of, not of their lifetime, the chance of millennia to own their own country by building it themselves. So it's you have these peasants who started building these mega hydropower stations, mega metallurgical plants, these huge industrial systems that were congruent with the size of the USSR or Russia as a piece of geography, and that could actually use, the resources, the minerals, the what have you, the hydropower that was there. And they had to do this because otherwise the West was going to pull Russia into little pieces and to completely recolonize it. So it was do or die. But basically, what we don't realize in the West is that the USSR, with the very wise guidance of Stalin, he made mistakes, but overall he was a remarkable statesman. And there again, one major thing in this book is the debunking of all the shit about Stalin. It's not Stalin who starved people to death. It's not Stalin who sent loads and loads and millions and millions of people to the gulags and things like that. He was not alone. He no more than Putin is alone. People keep saying, yes, Putin's Russia. Oh, Stalin's Russia. Stalin only became really completely powerful when he took all the reins of power in his hands during World War II, because too many of his generals were not with it. And he had this sharpness of mind. He had, you can go and read Churchill's assessments of Stalin. And Churchill was no friend of communism. But the way Churchill pays homage to the talents of Stalin is, coming from an enemy, it's pretty objective. So anyway, leaving Stalin aside, but basically under a clear leadership that had a clear roadmap, all these people rallied together to build up the country. And within 20 years, they started the reindustrialization of Russia, or the actual industrialization, in 1927. And, by 1941, so that's within 15 years, they already had the industries that were capable of producing all the weapons and the tanks and this, that, and the other to go and fight World War II. And this was without huge financial support from the West. Yes, there was technology transferred from the West, because the West, mainly Britain and the USA, they were interested in developing both Germany and Russia to fight each other to death. And they would pick up the pieces. Whereas, it's very, very complicated. The Russians and the Germans have a tradition of respecting each other, for several centuries. As warriors, they have tremendous respect for each other.
That reminds me of, I forgot his name. I'm so sorry about that. Maybe it will come later. But, one of these think tanks. And so this gentleman gave a speech, and he literally said, from the perspective of the United States, what cannot happen ever, ever is that Germany and Russia unite, because Russia having the resources, Germany having the know-how, they would become a powerhouse that is unpredictable and could dethrone the United States. And I'm, paraphrasing here.
No, but it's actually, yeah, it's absolutely correct. And I think I remember, but I don't remember the name any more than you. And I mean, this is the leitmotif also with Britain. I mean, Britain was obsessed with retaining her power globally as, Queen of the Seas and owning, most of the world. And then in the course of World War I and then World War II, well, she had to partner with the USA because she no longer could do it on her own. But that notion is still there. It's still there. And but it's you have to add to that the geopolitical notion of Mackinder. Have you heard of that? Late 19th century, early 20th century, geopolitics started to be a real thing, a real topic. And this fellow Mackinder came up with this notion of, like we're talking about Eurasia now with Putin, Xi, and the Iranians and everybody else, Eurasia. Well, Eurasia was already on the minds of the colonialists. They held China and India, the two great ancient civilizations. They did not hold Russia. And there was Germany, which was always the most dynamic, sorry, there's a dogfight happening. So, they had this concept of what they called the world island, and that's Eurasia. And the world island had a heartland, and that heartland basically is Russia. So, to reconstitute Eurasia, let's leave aside China for the time being. But the two sort of powerhouses of Germany and Russia, and it's not as if, the Russians are not only producers of primary resources, they have all sorts of extraordinary scientists who are also, they have a mystical, there's the other thing about the 19th century that you guys in Germany, you had the Romanticism period. And you had all this understanding of nature from Goethe with this scientific mysticism or mystical science, whatever. And you had, okay, later on in the 20th century, you had people like, what's his name? The water guy.
Water guy?
Yeah. Whom Hitler consulted with. It finishes with Hauser. Oh shit, it'll come back. Anyway, so there is this understanding of nature that is not, it's not like Francis Bacon, who wants to rape nature to go down to the root of every one of her secrets. It is this sort of feeling into the realities of nature and working with those realities. And so you've got the same thing, mutatis mutandis, in some of the great Russian inventors and scientists. So, I mean, it stands to reason that the world island, Eurasia, could be completely solidly put together by Germany being the leader of Western Europe, and Russia, being the middle, the large middle part between the West and the Far East. So yeah, I mean, that natural partnership, of course, had to be dismantled in every possible way. And both Stalin and Hitler kept postponing and postponing and postponing. And, they organized the famous Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement, which everybody blames for being the beginning of World War II, but no, sorry, it began earlier than that with the Polish thing, and even earlier than that with the the arrangements in Munich and all the separate arrangements made by the French and the Brits, whatever, all that stuff. So anyway, all this to say that Putin saying, that it was one of the great tragedies of the 20th century, it's true. It's this one and only state, country that was built by its own people for its own people, where nobody went hungry, where everybody had a place to stay, where, people were not, the idea of everybody putting in their honest work, but nobody was working for the profit of somebody who did not work. I mean, that, to the ancient Russian cultural ethos is shocking. That I should work my ass off for you out there to make a profit off of my back, whereby you don't work. That's not fair. So, they have this idea of, it's not just social justice, it's a matter of dignity and sort of everybody contributing so that the whole can serve every single one of us. And that's the way the Soviet Union ended up working. It was very hard work to get there, but they managed to build that. And so, if you consider it, apart from all the ideologies, apart from, Marxism and Leninism and all that, if you consider what they managed to achieve against the hostility and the constant warmongering and the threat of nuclear weapons, they managed to build this. And I mean, they were very proud of it, understandably. And then when this thing was taken away from them, the people, it was taken away from them against their will. There was a referendum in 1991. Do we keep the USSR? And the great majority voted yes, we keep the USSR. Gorbachev and pals immediately went off and made a secret agreement that, okay, that's the end of the USSR. On the other hand, just, in brackets, the USSR still exists. In the Charter of the United Nations, the country that we now call Russian Federation is still the USSR in the Charter of the United Nations. So the USSR has not actually ever been dismantled de jure. Okay, so I mean, all that is terribly complicated. But if you consider what those people managed to do, and then this country is taken away from them, and these huge mega factories are given away nearly for free to foreigners and to oligarchs and to mafia bosses, and little old and suddenly the economy fell apart. There were no more pensions. There was there was no salaries for school teachers. There were no salaries for people in the in the medical care. Whereas education, pensions, childcare, healthcare, everything was for free. I mean, I recently saw a figure of the people who were killed, let's say indirectly, by the breakup of the Soviet Union. It's at least 10 million in the 1990s. Bless you. So yeah, I mean, the whole business about the Soviet Union, we have so many cliches, so much falsehood that has been repeated to us over and over again in the West. Okay, I think it's my duty to, set the record straight, including all the shit, including all the bad stuff that happened in the USSR. But if you, put these things on the scales of, the goddess of justice, well, the good stuff that they did was very, very much more considerable than the bad stuff. And and it's no wonder, after World War II, there was a momentum for the countries of the colonial world to gain their independence. And most of them were not communist minded, but they wanted to follow the model of how the USSR had picked itself up and constructed itself. The USSR was had huge prestige and authority for the what we call the global South now. So anyway, all that is now it's
Yeah,
now
and
been
we see yeah, tendencies and events like that in Africa right now. It is no longer only Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger who have kicked out the French troops and are going to establish their own currency. They will no longer use the currency that is controlled
the
by the
French,
Central
yeah,
Bank
the
of France.
CFA, yeah, the
Yeah,
CFA
now
currency.
Chad has done the same, and Ivory Coast is going to kick them out as well. And we will see how that goes, and we will see how France.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean they're moving fast, and I think they have to move fast. At the same time, they have to kick out Bill Gates with his, his injections and his GMO and all sorts of other experimentation. They have to kick out big pharma. I mean, they've got, so much work to do,
Yeah.
and they have to clean up. There are still corrupt leaders,
Yeah,
in.
Kenya recently suspended the immunity of the Gates Foundation.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, gradually it's happening. I I think, most of the harm that all these assholes are inflicting is mainly in the West. It seems it's mainly the West, Europe and North America that are being,
Yeah,
this latest thing with the fog.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, like sort of hyper chemtrail fog, like they're
Yeah,
really
people
they're really
getting sick,
push they're pushing it like
nausea, and a sore throat, and you know, a natural fog. Yeah, it's not unheard of to have fog during this time of the year, but this fog does not disappear. When
and
it's
it stinks.
warmer, it
Yeah,
just stays and
and
stays.
and
And
it's stinky. It smells,
yeah, and
you
it's
know.
stinking, it
A
smells.
natural fog is fragrant.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
everything that is going on there. I mean, yeah, some of it is also we had, for instance, drones here in Germany over Ramstein, where all the drone attacks of the United States are coordinated. And but it's very pronounced in the United States. And then the creepy plasmoids that you can see in the air, and allegedly the plasmoids chasing the drones, and or the other way around, depending on whom you listen to. So something is up there.
Oh, and UFOs and disclosure and alien invasion and all that kind of thing. Oh yes, I mean, they're getting it in a big way. I know, but whatever. But yeah, but I mean, the poisoning of the food, the water, the air, the absolutely everything. Now they want to push for, more whatever, latest disease, whatever the latest disease. They're, killing millions of chickens again. And oh, it's whatever. But it's gonna, I think it's gonna fall apart. Yeah, th this year I think things are gonna start falling apart very, very quickly,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, and with dramatic consequences.
Mm. I think so too, that 2025 will be a remarkable year, but also a year that shakes up a lot of things, and it will be scary.
Yeah.
Yeah. If the known structures and systems collapse one by one.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. Everything has become so complex and intertwined in the modern world,
Yeah.
and people are so dependent on, convenience, supermarkets. I mean, things working, trains being on time. Not every Westerner has had third world training.
No, no, definitely not. You said in the beginning that when you went back to the West, that it took you 10 years to adjust to it. What was so hard coming from the Soviet Union and then being in the West again?
I found the West was cold. There was no heart.
No
It
hard.
was, yeah, it was that aspect of, in spite of me being a foreigner and consequently suspect from their point of view, um, and in spite of me supposedly having to suspect them, there was this just human to human reality. And yeah, some people like to talk about the Russian soul. That's such a cliche that uh, I don't buy it. Especially, it's not just a matter of soul, it's a matter of, I mean, these are people who have been through hardship nonstop for the past 400 years. Um, and yet they have no hatred. There's a generosity, there is uh, it's really very, very difficult to describe. And that's part of the Russian mystery, which I believe comes from, oh, we're having pussycats want to have a podcast. We're having a pussycat podcast. Come on, Isai. Come on, come on. Show your little face. Don't you want to show your little face? You're being shy.
Yeah.
Anyway, hello, hello. Um, they, I mean, the, there's a very, very deep mystery that is, I feel, and the more I read, the more I get confused, the more I don't understand anything, the more I figure this is very, very, very old. And this whole business of the West hating Russia and blaming everything on Russia has to do with something, I'm pretty sure, that is very old, very esoteric, and I don't know what it is.
Mm.
And I don't think there's any source, like books or things like that, because so much of their history has been, even the Romanov, the Tsarist period, um, they were busy rewriting the books that came before, and the books that came before were busy rewriting the chronicles that came before. So, the historians have huge fights precisely because so much of the sources are, it's difficult to determine what is true and what is not true. So I actually, what makes this particular book, especially strange for me and hard, is that it is working so much within my subconscious.
Mhm.
I mean, normally when I write and I'm inspired, I'll just continue and continue. I'll, do 10 pages in one sitting. With this Russian thing, I cannot do more than 2 pages a day. If
Mm.
I do an extra page, I'm going to need more sleep. And my sleep is Russian. I have Russian dreams every night.
Mm.
How does that work? I know I've had past lives. that were Russian lives. And like when you go into a regression into a past life, you don't get all the details that fill in all the gaps. You get the main events. So I got the main events of a particular past life when my fiancé did not show up. We were supposed to elope together. He didn't show up. I knew what had happened to him, so I had to run away. I ran away into the forest and I became a kind of, solitary hermit, herbal woman out in the forest in Siberia. Now, with the books that I have read about what happened to the people in the centuries before the 20th, now I have the details why my fiancé didn't show up and why I went out into the forest and how it is that I became a solitary, kind of holy woman out in the forest. I found the details in the books. So there is this strange interaction of the intellectual part of the work that I'm doing and this other stuff that lives in the subconscious, so it lives in past lives, and this sense that I have that, often I feel, come on, this is too hard. This book, let a Russian do this book. Why me? And, the voice says, well, precisely, a Russian can't do it because they're in the thick of it. But you are sufficiently attuned and you've had Russian past lives to feel that there is much more that you have to go and look for. Okay, so I carry on with my 2 pages a day, and it's Judith. This is such an adventure. I thought Krivda was an adventure, but Krivda was actually easy because I had the notion that, okay, we've got this problem of religion that starts way back when with some gods. It goes through the Yahweh thing, the Christian thing, and then it morphs into the money thing. All these things are religions, all the way up to AI, which is now a god. Simple. All I have to do is put together the pieces and, okay, then I have to put the pieces and write the book. That was not necessarily an easy book to write, but I could see the arc. Here, I'm having to work with all sorts of contradictory material from Russia. I'm using 95, 96% only Russian sources. So I want to write this thing from a Russian point of view. I may need to use some English language sources or other language sources if there are specific details that I can't find in Russian and I really need them, but otherwise, no. And predominantly using books of this latest 30-year period when they were no longer constrained by Marxist ideology and when the curiosity of some of them has been exploding like crazy. And at the same time, I'm feeding this also through the fact that I'm an anthropologist who's been living for 25 years in the poor rural areas of a certain part of the global south. And I'm recognizing so many things in the descriptions of the peasantry of the 17th, 18th, 19th century in Russia. It is so similar. The climate is different, but certain basic ethical and social elements, they're the same because that's how poor people in the countryside survive everywhere in the world. And so I'm being able to fill in certain things that historians can't because they don't have the kind of field experience that I have. And I'm only interested in what happens to the people. So of course I have to talk about this Tsar and that priest, who did this or that horrible thing, and how did the people react to it, and what kind of peasant wars. There were peasant wars across the centuries, Judith. These people did not take it lying down. They ran away. There were periods. Peter the Great, the so-called Great, he killed so many people of his, of the poor peasants who were treated like shit. 20% of the population within 20 years of his reign, Russia lost 20% of her population. Because he used 100,000 hundreds of thousands in building St. Petersburg and, the great harbors, leading out to the west, and in his wars and this, that, and the other. It's, just absolutely crazy. So I figure there is enough material for me to write a story, not a history, but a story of the Russian people from their point of view, on their terms, and to try through the stuff that they went through, to start dropping pebbles on my path for the next book, which will be what came before the 17th century. So I'm using the part of the Russian history that is sufficiently understandable. There has been a lot of scholarship about it, lots of it contradictory, but there is enough that I can find my own clarity. I can use my own pattern recognition from the point of view of the people to see the consistency, how it all makes sense, how those 3 centuries under the Romanov dynasty, which was completely Western oriented and completely hated the Russian people, how that caused the revolutions, and then the people building their own state by the people for the people. And then, of course, how it falls apart, because there again, the leadership, the elites, want to live like the elites in the Romanov time, like idle and taking the people for granted. There's this strange pattern that keeps coming back. And so once I've done 17th to beginning of 21st century, which I hope to finish within this year, then I'm going to have the much harder journey of before. And before, what I already know is that the West was already after Russia, which was not yet Russia, starting around the year 1000. It's the popes. The popes.
This was the public hour. For full access of the entire interview, please join our Patreon community. Thank you.